watching the live streams for our worship services on Facebook. You don't need to change anything. For technological reasons, I'm sure none of you care about, we can dual stream to multiple platforms there. We can't with this thing, and that's satisfactory enough. So today we are concluding season of Easter class that we have been going through. Although it's not technically the season of Easter anymore, but for the very high liturgical reason of Summer Sunday School starts next week, not this week. We got one more week of this class. So we'll be concluding our resurrection appearances of Jesus. And I'll be honest with you, I am excited that I get to teach this one, because this is a fun one. Super unique, as you might guess, being that we're in the book of Revelation, as opposed to, well, one of the Gospels or the book of Acts, which is where you tend to see Jesus appearing. But we do have probably more than one, but certainly one appearance of Jesus in the book of Revelation that at least fits our theme here. But before we begin with that, I'm going to do the teacher thing. Right? For those of you who don't know, I did spend a brief period of time learning how to be a teacher at a college, and they all told me to always say, "What did you learn last time?" So, what did you learn last time?
I wasn't here.
Oh, so Andy's pretending that he gets a pass, but now Andy's going to get extra questions next week about this one. So for those of you who were present and don't have take-home work, what did you all learn? What was the topic of last class? Saul's conversion. Right. Okay, so we have Jesus appearing to Saul, who would be Paul, and then there's that whole he's got two names thing, which is, I suppose, interesting if you're into that sort of thing. But absolutely, so we have Jesus appearing to Saul. What did that look like?
Flashing light.
A big flashing light, right? So, in many ways, it's a pretty unique appearance of Christ. In fact, it's going to come up. We're going to mention and take a brief look back at the conversion of Saul, and one that I think got cut because Summer Sunday School starts next week and not in 2 weeks. You guys did not cover the martyrdom of Stephen, correct?
Right.
All right, well, we'll reference back to that. We can stay very surface level with that reference, so we don't need to have you have already gone through, right? It's not like math, where if you miss a lesson, you're just in trouble for the rest of the year. At least that's what I was told. I'm not a math guy. You can ask my brother about that. So let us begin then with actually reading the text, right? It's a great place to start, especially when you're looking at the text. This one's not terribly long, so I would like to just have one volunteer to read through. This is, by the way, Revelation chapter 1, verses 9 through 20 that we'll be covering today. So, any brave volunteers? Thank you, Jeff. You're right next to the camera, too, so that's perfect.
I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, "Write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and to Smyrna and to Pergamum and to Thyatira and to Sardis and to Philadelphia and to Laodicea." Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands one like a son of man, clothed like a long robe, and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his right hand on me, and saying, "Fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are, and those that are to take place after this. One more. Okay. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches.
Thank you, Jeff. Now, before we begin today, you will likely walk out of this room with one of 2 opinions. One is that you would like for me to teach a class on Revelation, which we'll see. The second is that you would never want me to teach a class on Revelation. It's going to go one of 2 ways. And part of the reason for that is and you'll all be shocked, I'm growing as a person. I am limiting myself so much today. Because there's so much that we could talk about. We could spend more than one class just on this section of chapter 1. But I'm limiting myself with a few excursions to talking about just Jesus appearing here, right? Now, before we get into the actual text, it's helpful for us to understand the setting, right? I mean, if you're taking any of my classes where we go over a book of the Bible, this is what we do first. What is going on in the background, right? What's the setting of the book, right? This is your English lit classes coming all the way back. So, when does this narrative, and I will say narrative, right? This is unlike what happens later, starting with chapter 4 in Revelation, which is a revelatory, apocalyptic vision, right? Which is a fancy way of saying stuff that didn't actually happen, but it is meant to convey a picture. This actually happened. John saw Jesus like this at a particular time in history, right? This is not the prophetic, and I use prophetic in the way I mean prophetic, not the way most people use prophetic. It has nothing to do with the future, right? This is not the vision portion of Revelation, at least not the vision proper. So when does this take place? Ooh, look at you going straight to the date. We'll get to the date itself in a minute here. Let's just start there. We don't know exactly when this is happening, but we have a few pretty good guesses, and you're not far off. This took place most likely during what is known as the Domitian persecution. Now, there are 4 great persecutions of the church. These are all under the Roman Empire. The first, any guesses, is not the Domitian. Domitian's second. Guesses on the first, you know his name. They're all named after emperors. Nero, right? The persecution under Nero. The second is Domitian. The third I don't remember. And the fourth is the Diocletian persecution, which takes place almost immediately before the Council of Nicaea. So this is most likely this is during the Domitian persecution. There's a chance it's during Nero's persecution, but it's an extremely small chance. And so, for the most part, at least for us, we're going to rule that out. Now, for those of you who don't know offhand the ruling dates of all the Roman emperors and when they were persecuting the church at large, if this did take place during Domitian's persecution, that places us between the years 89 and 96 AD. So right before the turn of the century, sometime during that chunk, right? How do we know that it's during a persecution? Or why do we suspect very heavily that it's during a persecution?
John's in prison?
John is not technically in prison. And I'm only being pedantic here because there is a difference. Okay. He's not in prison, he is in exile, right? So prison is where they say, we're going to take you and we're going to bury you in a building inside of us. Exile is where they say, go away, we never want to see you again, right? So it effectively is the same thing, but in opposite directions, right? The main difference for our purposes here is that with John on exile, he still can communicate with people in a way that he really can't in prison. John is not in fear of execution during his exile. There were a couple attempted executions of John and all sorts of stuff that's mostly myth. We don't know for sure. But John's not really in immediate danger of execution because he's in exile. And the Romans considered exile the same thing. Actually, they considered it worse than being killed because you're made a pariah and there's shame and that sort of thing associated with it. But right, he is in exile on the island of Patmos, which is, for the geography nerds out there, it's an island off the coast of Anatolia. Anatolia is Turkey today, right? All right, when we can say even more particularly, although it's a vague way of saying it, what day of the week does this take place on? Yeah, I heard it. Sunday. How do we know it's Sunday that this took place on? Oh, it says so. Yeah, look at that, right? Right at the beginning. I, John, your partner in the tribulation, in the kingdom, and patient endurance, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God. That's how we know he's being persecuted against. It's possible, right? There were little persecutions, but this is probably during one of the great persecutions. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. So, the first half of that's a little bit more confusing, but we'll cover that. The second part is on the Lord's day. What is the Lord's day?
Sunday.
Oh, wow, confidence. What is the Lord's day? Because we're not Seventh-day Adventists. Sunday, absolutely. Why? Excuse me. Why is Sunday the Lord's day? That's right. Jesus rose from the dead. Which day did God rest from creation? Saturday. That's right. Jesus rises on the 8th day, Sunday, the day of the new creation. The day. That's why Jews celebrate Sabbath, thank you, on Saturday, but Sunday takes over as the Lord's Day because that's the day of the week that Christ rose from the dead. So what does this in the Spirit mean? So these are right here, and maybe a little bit later, are the questions that you actually will be able to answer. In all likelihood, so get your answers out now, because they're going to get really tricky in a minute, and I'm not expecting you to just know the answers. So what does it mean when John says he's in the Spirit?
Is he praying?
Praying is one of the potential options. There are two. Praying is one of them. That to be in the Spirit means to be in prayer, at least in the early church, right? Today it might mean some different things, but to be in the Spirit means to be in prayer. And where do you all do a lot of praying? Where are you doing a lot of praying on the Lord's Day?
Church.
In church, right? So John is likely in some form of worship service. We know that there were other exiles there with him, so who knows? He may have been alone. He may have been with a couple, not a bunch, but a couple of other individuals. But in short, where does the whole book of Revelation, by the way, takes place on a Sunday while John is worshiping in prayer? He's reading the Word of God, right? That is what it means to be in the Spirit, at least when the Bible talks about being in the Spirit. All right, question 2. What is striking and different about this appearance of Jesus?
He's kind of scary.
He's kind of scary, right? How many of you, right, when you were a small child, would say your prayers at the end of the day, and you'd think about Jesus that you're praying to, and he had bright white hair, his face was shining like the sun, he had a sword sticking out of his mouth. Is that the Jesus you all just pictured in your mind? Right, he's kind of scary looking. And John agrees with you, by the way. We're going to get to that. But John finds this vision of Jesus absolutely terrifying, right? We've seen Jesus say, "Fear not," before. It's different in this account. We'll get to that near the end of the lesson today. But what else is different, right? I mentioned a few of those things.
What seems odd is his hair was white.
Mm-hmm. His hair is white, which seems odd because in all the pictures that we have of Jesus, his hair is never white. So what's up with that, right? We'll tell you what. I wrote a list of everything I saw that was kind of weird, kind of different, unique about this particular appearance of Christ. And I'll be honest, I split it into 2. So we're going to cover the majority of the list in this question, and then we'll come back to the second little tail end later. So this is what I noticed that was different about this appearance of Jesus. It was announced with a loud trumpet. Jesus appeared like a son of man, which there's something different about that. We'll talk about what John means when he says that Jesus appeared like a son of man. It doesn't mean he just looked like a guy, right? That's not what John is getting at. He's wearing a long robe, so much so that John notes it. He has a golden sash around his chest. He has white hair like wool or like snow. His eyes are like flames of fire, and his feet are like burnished bronze. Like I said, there are some more things like that sword that we haven't talked about yet, but I'm going to get to that in a following question. So, announced the trumpet, like a son of man, a long robe, golden sash, white hair, eyes like fire, and feet like burnished bronze. Now, this is the part, this next one. Why does Jesus appear this way? I'm not expecting any of you to necessarily know the answers, but we'll try and work our way into them. Now, before we begin, and this is part of that you may never want me to teach a Revelation class in the future sort of thing, but one of the commentaries, or the commentary that I primarily use for my study of Revelation, was written by Dr. Brighton, who's not the one who was serving Warner Robins, it's his uncle, so it's Lewis Brighton. And he implies that to understand the book of Revelation, first, you should get a PhD in the Old Testament. Revelation is pulling enormously, not exclusively, but significantly from the Old Testament. And so, whenever you run into an image that seems odd, which in the book of Revelation, there are a couple, the first thing you should do is read the entire Old Testament and see if that image pops up anywhere else, right? By the way, this is a great way to read your Old Testament about 80 times. So maybe you should do it. That's not a bad idea. The other thing you can do is let Dr. Brighton do that for you and write it down in a nice blue commentary that you can purchase from CPH, which is what I did. So, what is this? The announcing with the loud trumpet. I think we can figure this one out. What is going on with this announcement with the trumpet? What do you guys think?
Well, doesn't a trumpet signify the entrance of the king?
Absolutely, right? I mean, how many of you have seen like a cartoon or a movie with a king walking in, right? It starts out with all the trumpets going, right? The trumpets announce the entrance of the king, the procession of the king. This is a triumphal announcement, right? Christ is not, so when we talk about Christ, we talk about his humiliation and his exaltation, particularly when we read the Creed. So when we talk about the humiliation of Christ, this is the first chunk of the second article of the Creed, right? This is the became man part, but it's incarnate. It's not that he became man, it's that he became subject under creation. I have a whole class on this I'm getting ready to re-upload to YouTube. So if you're really confused about the Christology of this, just go check that class out. It'll be good. Actually, the Christology one might already be on there. Anyway. So from the incarnation, becomes subject to creation through his burial. That is the humiliation of Christ, right? That is Christ doing his work. And then, beginning with the descent into hell, up through the seated at the right hand of the Father, coming to judge the living and the dead, that is the exaltation of Christ. We talked about this, actually, it's kind of a background to the text that we were reading today in church, particularly that John text, where John says, well, Jesus was talking about giving the Spirit, but it didn't happen until he was glorified. Right, until the ascension into heaven, which is part of what's happening there. And so you have, once Jesus is glorified, and now he is glorified above all creatures, right? Read the book of Hebrews. That's the big emphasis on the beginning, is that Christ is glorified above all things. The being worthy of most glory, honor, and worship is the Son, is the second person of the Trinity. And so here we have Christ announcing himself as the exalted second person of the Trinity, triumphant in his struggles and his humiliation, in his fight against sin, death, and the devil. He is now the triumphant, glorious Christ. And that's what John's seeing. By the way, this is the only person, John here, who sees the exalted Christ and writes about it. So there are two others who maybe got to see the exalted Christ, kind of depending on how you read things. The first one is Stephen, right? So Stephen, right before he gets martyred, he looks up into heaven and he sees Jesus at the right hand of the Father. Stephen saw the exalted Christ. So why doesn't Stephen, this might be a bit blunt, but why doesn't Stephen describe Jesus in a similar way that John does?
He was
He was martyred. He didn't have a chance to write down what he saw. So he witnessed it, don't know exactly what he saw because he didn't write it down, obviously. The second one to see the exalted Christ is Paul, right? That's what we talked about last week. But what did you make note of? What did Jesus look like to Paul Saul?
flashing light.
A big blinding light. Paul saw the exalted Christ, but he didn't get the opportunity to see details. He just saw the blinding glory of Christ. Now, there's another time that Paul gets whisked away into the third heaven, and in a really confusing passage that has been making lots of people say all sorts of things. Paul probably saw the exalted Christ there, but he doesn't describe it. And again, that's a weird kind of just aside that Paul makes, and you can ask another time about what is going on there. But regardless, Paul doesn't describe what he sees when he's whisked off into the third heaven. So John is the only one who gets to see the exalted Christ and describe him. So this is, in many ways, this is a very unique vision of Christ. This is the only vision of Jesus that we get in his true, full blast, exalted state. Now, there are a couple other places we're going to talk about both of them where we get close, where we approach that, but we don't get there. This is the only place in Scripture. He appears like a son of man. This is one of those, you can need a PhD in the Old Testament to really get the full picture, but you don't need to read the whole thing. Just go read Ezekiel and Daniel. And that is the image that is being pulled on here. In short, this is a recognition of the two natures of Christ in their exalted glory. Christ is both God and man. Right, so this is John recognizing that Christ does not slough off his humanity in the ascension, right? Christ retains his human nature, not only now, but into eternity. Once the human and the divine were joined together in the person of Christ, according to all those giant Latin words that I taught some of you guys, it is an unbreakable bond. Christ is still human. Christ is still incarnate. Now, he's also omnipresent, which is super fun. I'm sure Pastor Jordan will explain that in his Trinity sermon this coming Sunday. So he's got a lot to do, but again, he hasn't told me he won't. So he's not here either. Weighing the options. So questions on those first two: this Son of Man, two natures thing, and this exalted trumpet triumphant thing. All right. He's wearing a long robe. So this long robe is most likely, and by the way, all of this is most likely, right? John doesn't explain. He explains a few things, but very few things he does explain. So this is most likely given the context of the rest of the Bible. We are seeing Jesus in his priestly garment, right? So Christ has three roles. He functions in three different ways, right? He is Christ the King, Christ the priest, and Christ the prophet. Good. I had to keep my gears spinning back up, so thank you for that one. Prophet, priest, and king, the three offices of Christ. This is Christ being presented, among others, right? We've already seen some kingly stuff. He's being presented in his priestly role. This we can see in great detail in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews does hit all of the three different roles of Christ. There's a term for it that's just escaping me right now. But Hebrews really focuses on the priestly office. Office, that's the word. The priestly office of Christ. So that Christ is functioning as our great high priest, right? And our eternal high priest, right? Because that was part of the problem with the Old Testament system, is the high priest kept dying. And so you needed to get new ones, and so you kind of had to refresh the system. And by the way, it tended to go downhill. Every once in a while it would pop back up, right? So you got like Aaron, downhill, Zadok, downhill, and then it kind of didn't go back up for a long time. But Jesus is the great high priest. He's perfect and he's eternal. He is our high priest for the rest of eternity. So he's praying for us. He's pleading the case of his own blood before the throne of God. So basically making sure you're always forgiven. All of that kind of stuff. So we see John see that a picture of that priestly role of Christ. The golden sash. This is one of those places I mentioned earlier. You need the Old Testament and some other stuff. This is one of those other stuff places. Mostly this is, you need an understanding of intertestamental Jewish culture, which I'm sure you will have. Right. The golden sash is an image drawn out of two different dynasties. One is the Babylonian Empire, so that one is Old Testament. But primarily, especially with the way it's being worn across the chest rather than across the waist, this is a reference to the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, I know that I have taught at least like 3 people in here what the Hasmonean dynasty is, but it was like 4 years ago. Does anyone remember what the Hasmonean dynasty was? You get bonus Jesus points if you do. So the Hasmonean dynasty is the dynasty of, is the Jewish kingdom that got restarted into the intertestamental period after the great Maccabean revolt, right? Judas Maccabeus, that guy, Handel has a whole thing about him, but it's also Hanukkah comes out of this time, right? The Festival of the Lights, all of that. But the Maccabees, or the Hasmoneans, again, everyone had all sorts of different names back then. Part of how they demonstrated their kingly office was a golden sash that they would wear across their chest. And so John is kind of pulling off of this kingly, intertestamental, conquering image there. But again, this is just another pointing towards the kingly office of Christ. White hair, like wool or snow. I'm going to make you guys guess on this one for at least a second. Right? Why does Jesus have white hair? We all know it's brown. We've seen his pictures, right? Why does he have white hair in the gospel, in the Revelation of John?
Wisdom and dignity.
Absolutely. Is that what it says in the Lutheran Study Bible? Or did you get
Yes.
them all on your own? All right. Absolutely. White hair is a signifier of wisdom and dignity and the respect that comes with old age, or at least came with old age in John's day, right? Now, this is a complete and total aside, but it's one of those things about history that drives me nuts that people say. And some of you have heard this speech before. How many of you have heard that before the invention, the advent of modern medicine, the average life expectancy was 30? So I and everyone in here should be dead. How many of you have heard that before? How many of you know that it's utter and complete nonsense? Good. It is true. The average life expectancy was 30. Why was the average life expectancy 30 when most people were living, well, most people who lived past 30, well past 30?
Because so many babies and young people die.
Child mortality rates were extremely high, and if you have a fairly large population that is dying at a very young age, you're going to ruin your statistics, right? So if you make it past 12, you have a pretty good chance of making it to at least 60. Now, that being said, someone in their 80s was still fairly rare, but certainly not unheard of in the ancient world. But it signified a couple of things. If you could make it to 80 in a time when getting a cut at the wrong time could just kill you because they don't have antibiotics, if you could make it to 80 in a world that was rife with wars and all sorts of other dumb things that could get you killed, well, there was respect. There was wisdom there, right? And so there was a high respect. Anyone who had gray hair or white hair was seen as a figure to be honored because they made it that long, right? blessed by the gods, that sort of thing.
So when Jacob goes to Egypt and Jacob blesses Pharaoh, is it because Jacob's an elderly man that he's blessing Pharaoh?
Probably. You're really trying to get me off here. On a really wild tangent. Jacob is also the one that holds the blessing from Abraham, right? So God gives the fourfold blessing to Abraham, and Abraham gives it to Isaac, and then Jacob, depending on how you want to read Genesis, which is somewhat complicated, Jacob was supposed to receive that blessing, kind of steals it. Who's at fault? That's not what we're talking about. But that's why Esau's actually so mad, right? When Jacob actually runs away, because Jacob already got all the money, right? When Esau traded away all his money, all his inheritance for the bowl of stew, right? Now, whether that would have stood up even in ancient legal court remains to be seen. But Jacob doesn't run away. He's like, well, my brother's an idiot, and I fooled him. Bummer for him. Jacob runs away in fear because he steals his father's blessing. It has nothing to do with inheritance at that point. It is that promise that God has made, and we see that it's the promise of salvation that is attached to it. So that is also going on there. But yes, old individuals, elderly people, their blessing was much respected. And so we see Jesus here depicted with white hair as this mantle of honor, of glory, of wisdom, right? So that's what's going on here. Also, I mean, we have an association with the color white, and it's not wrong, especially when you're seeing white like snow, white like wool. What also is going along there? Purity. Absolutely, right? I mean, though your sins may be scarlet, I shall make them white as snow, right? And so we have both the wool and the snow are images of purity, a purging of sins sort of thing. Eyes like flame of fire. And it's Pentecost, so the fire thing might throw you off because this really doesn't have to do with the Spirit. Fire here is an exilic symbol of divinity. Exilic just means once the Babylonian captivity happened. So the Babylonians and the Persians saw fire as the manifestation of the divine. They were Zoroastrians, in case you didn't know that already. And Zoroastrians have sacred fires. And so fire is seen as a earthly representation of the divine. And imagery-wise, the Jews in exile picked that up. And so they identify God with fire. Also, in their own history, there's an association of God with fire. Exodus is one of these places. Where do we see God as fire in Exodus?
Burning bush.
Burning bush is one. There's two.
The flame of fire.
Yes, the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke. Both of whom are the second person of the Trinity, but that's one of my soapboxes. Right, absolutely. So fire is the symbol of the divine. Fire is also holy and purging of sin in the presence of God. Think Isaiah when he has his vision or out-of-body, in-body experience, whatever it is in Isaiah chapter 6. What does the angel do to make Isaiah worthy of being in the presence of God? Grabs a coal from the altar, puts it on his tongue, right? Fire is a purging, right? You can think Peter, right? Gold refined in fire sort of thing. Fire burns out sin. Fire burns away evil, burns away wickedness. John didn't know it, but he's also referencing Ghost Rider and the Penance Stare, which, does anyone know what I'm talking about? Okay, we got one. Ghost Rider is a Marvel comic where a skeleton can burn people's sins away. He also condemns them to hell, but that's a different thing. With fire, right? And so Jesus has fiery eyes. It's a similar sort of thing. There's a movie with Nick Cage. It's not great, but that's there. So there are the eyes like flame of fire, feet like burnished bronze. This image comes up elsewhere in the Bible. Does anyone know where?
Daniel?
It is Daniel, right? That other super easy to understand book of the Bible, right? In short, because our time is short, these feet like burnished bronze are the strength that conquers enemies, smashes the enemies under the feet of the army, sort of thing. Again, that's Bronze Age sort of imagery that gets pulled in here. Questions on question 2, which is the longest one of these, don't worry.
Got a question.
Yes?
So, Jesus appeared this way in this instance. Is that what we should expect him to look like when we see him?
Maybe. The image that is evoked is how you should expect to see Jesus. Will Jesus have white hair when we see him? I don't know. Quite frankly, Jesus might have had white hair his whole life. Like I said, we don't actually have selfies of Jesus. But the image, I think, yes. The countenance, if you will, probably not. There's also in here, and I think this is somewhere in this, but I'm not sure, Jesus is appearing to John in glory and in power. Jesus does come to us in peace as well. He's still glorified, but he does come to us in peace. Now, when you do see Jesus, he doesn't look like this very often, does he? Right? When do you see Jesus? Oh, come on. There we go! In the Lord's Supper, right? You see Jesus and he looks like a piece of bread and a cup of wine, right? Jesus is still coming to you. He's coming to you in peace, right? He comes to you in the waters of holy baptism as well. Jesus is there. He is truly present, right? That's what we believe, teach, and confess. That's why I pointed out my 2 confirmation teachers, because I just forced 3 middle schoolers to go through 2 years of classes with me to make that point. We made some other points along the way, but basically that's a big part of why we do it. Why we make them wait until they understand that they're holding Jesus, right? That's why, and if you don't know, this is my personal soapbox, you do now. That's why we should be singing the Nunc Dimittis after the Lord's Supper and not Thank the Lord. Thank the Lord is a wonderful little hymn, and I really do truly enjoy watching all the families shout with thanksgiving. It's very fun, it's heartwarming. The Nunc is better. Because it talks about holding Jesus in your hands. Oh, it's so good. Anyway, that's a fight I often lose during hymn planning, as you might know. I get it during the penitential seasons, though, so I'll take what I can get. Good. Other questions about the second question? All right. Well, look at that. Let's go read Daniel chapter 7, verse 9 through 12. It's almost as if I wrote this. And by the way, there is another place in Daniel that we could read, but for the sake of time we're not, and that's in Daniel chapter 10. It's more of an offhanded reference to the humanity of Christ that is reflected in that Son of Man comment and a few others. So if you want to go read through Daniel chapter 10 in your own time, you are certainly welcome to. May I have a volunteer to read? It's not quite as long. Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 12. Thank you, Jim.
As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hairs of his head were like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked in them because of the sound of the great words that a horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed and his body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. You want to go all the way to 12?
We can leave it there. So, and for the sake of time, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but how is this vision of Daniel similar and different to the one John sees?
Here.
The hair, good, that's the easiest similarity, right? They both have white hair.
Clothing was white as well.
Clothing's white. Fire is present here, although it's not out of the eyes, it's in the flaming wheels of the throne. Daniel has some extra images, right? So that's a difference there. There's no throne when John sees Jesus. What else?
There's people worshiping and serving here.
Right, so in John, there's no vision of individuals. Now, if we're missing something because we're looking only at like 10 verses or 11 verses out of Revelation, we will see myriads and myriads worshiping Jesus if you keep reading the book of Revelation. But at least in our section, it's just Jesus and John. So that is definitely a difference there. So this is one of these places that I kind of offhand mentioned earlier, where we do kind of see the exalted Christ outside of John. But there's a few things going on. One, this is a bit more dimly lit, to use that phrase. And whether you associate the Ancient of Days with the Father or with the Son is a matter of interpretation. And so there's less clarity there as to who exactly is being spoken of. I'll give you one guess as to who I think it is, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. But we do see these images of purity, of fire. So if this is a picture of the Father, then at the very least we are seeing the Son identified as divine with the Father in the same way. If this is an image of the Son, then the glorified Christ is showing himself, revealing the future to Daniel. But again, like I said, for the sake of time, that's all we're going to do there, unless there's any questions about this section of Daniel in relation to Revelation 1:9. All right. So move on to question 4 here. What is the significance of Christ's voice, the 7 stars, the 2-edged sword, and the face that shines like the sun? Let's start with the 7 stars, because I think you guys can get that one. What is going on with the 7 stars that Jesus holds in his hand?
7 churches.
They are, oh, Len, what a scholar, right? We did read to the end of the section. It does just tell you there, right? So like I said, occasionally, even in the book of Revelation, John just interprets it for us, which is super helpful. So yes, we see the 7 stars. They are the 7 angels to the 7 churches, which here's one of these places where you're going to witness me actually have some self-control. That is an extremely interesting topic, what that part of that interpretation means. But I won't tell you, we won't get into that because we have 15 minutes. And it would take the rest of our 15 minutes. If you're curious, you can come and ask me. I love questions if you hadn't noticed that about me. So feel free to ask another time if you're really wondering what's going on with these 7 angels to the 7 churches and all of that. It's exciting, but not what we're here for. But Jesus is holding the churches in his hand, right? And just very briefly, we can extend that not just to the 7 churches of Anatolia, but these are the churches of the world. Those 7 churches are probably the biggest churches that were in John's diocese, because John was a bishop. So those are probably the big churches John was overseeing at this time. And so we can naturally bring an extension out to Christ. Doesn't just hold those 7 churches in his hand, he holds all of the churches of the world. He holds his church in his hands. All right, what about the voice like the roar of many waters? Where in the Bible do you hear things about the roar of many waters? The roaring water. Well, someone has a reference that I was not thinking of. So that's possible, but don't say it louder because that's not where I want to go. So I referenced it in my sermon this morning. Creation. the waters of creation, these roaring springs of water. We also have some Noah stuff going on here, but this is the mighty voice that cries out over creation, right? So we have here the work of the Word, right? The Word of the Father, the Word of God, second person of the Trinity in this creative power and authority role. From his mouth came a double-edged sword. I've always liked this one because I think it sounds cool. And at the church that I grew up in, there was a stained glass window that had this picture of Jesus, although it was really stylized and even stranger than you might think. But there was someone with a sword coming out of his mouth. I always thought that was interesting. So what's up with this double-edged sword? It's the Word. Okay, good. The Word, absolutely. The double-edged sword is the Word. Why is it double-edged? There's all sorts of reasons why people have come up with this double-edged thing. But we're going to go with a very Lutheran response to this one. By the way, having a double-edged sword was not super common in the ancient world. The gladius was double-edged, but most swords are for hacking. Making pointy swords is harder, especially with armor. Hitting with a sword is much easier. That's your ancient warfare, or classical warfare, I suppose, lesson for the day. Banging things is easier than poking things. So having a double-edged sword is not unique, but it's somewhat odd. We know the sword is the Word of God. Why does it have two edges? We are Lutherans. Law and gospel, right? Absolutely, right? So the Word has both law and gospel associated with it. There are other ways to take it, and I think not all the time, but often in the book of Revelation, there is more than one way to interpret various images. Now, do not hear that as there is no wrong way to interpret the images. There are super wrong ways to misinterpret the various things in the book of Revelation. If you want an example of this, go ask the Jehovah's Witnesses what they think of Revelation chapter 7, because they're extremely wrong about their interpretation there. And if they read the whole chapter in context, they would understand that. But this is me on a soapbox again, right? So there are wrong interpretations of Revelation, but I think especially here we see the images can mean more than one thing. That's kind of a hallmark of apocalyptic literature. Good. His face was like the sun, shining in full strength. So I'm going to say something here, and it's just for Joe, so if it doesn't make any sense to you, I just had a very modalistic thought about this one. Yeah, so, anyway, if you don't know what that meant, don't worry about it. That was a reference to an old heresy and a video with cartoon Irish people. But that's a thought for him. Why is Jesus' face shining like the sun? Well, what's up with the sun? What does it do? Light. Okay, good. How is Jesus associated with light? In him there is no darkness. Right? Jesus, he is the light of the Father. He is the glory of the world. He shines the light in the darkness. At the end of the book of Revelation, we'll hear that there is no sun because Jesus is the light. Doesn't mean that there's not going to be a sun in the new creation. Just means that it's an image for how bright the glory of Christ is. We've seen this before, right? There are a couple places where we see Jesus shining like the sun. There's one super obvious one.
On the mountaintop?
On the mountain, which mountain was it? Correct, we don't know. The mountain of transfiguration is what we call it, where Jesus was shining like the sun. And here's another place where we see Jesus in his glory. But it's definitely toned down. And the main reason, just for the sake of time that we know this, is what did John do when he saw Jesus on the mountain of transfiguration? What did he do with his body?
Fell to the ground.
He didn't. He just froze.
Oh.
But he stayed standing. In this, what happens to John? Not only did he fall onto the ground, he fell like he was a corpse. Right? This all but killed John to witness, right? He can stand in the glory of the transfiguration, and Peter didn't even say something stupid in the glory of the transfiguration. John was all but killed when he saw the glory of the truly exalted, unbridled, unmitigated glory of Christ. We see another example where this kind of happens in the Old Testament. Tricky one. Who sees the glory of God or the grace of God?
Moses.
Moses, right? And does anyone remember what happened to Moses when he came down from the mountain? Everyone started screaming in terror and throwing cloths at him because his face was glowing. And they said, Moses, put the veil on, we're not looking at you anymore, right? And he just saw the glory of God, right? Who did Moses see on Sinai? Oh, the second person of the Trinity. You can see this is a theme with me. Is that whenever anyone sees God, it's Jesus. That's who they see. There are some exceptions to that. This is Pentecost, after all. But they see Christ. All right? All right, let's get to this last question here, just so that we can get to the comfort part of it. So how are Jesus' words in verses 17 and 18 words of comfort? So I will read them again. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead, right? That's not the comfort part. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not. I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I'm alive forevermore. I have the keys of death and Hades. How are these words of comfort?
This is a victory. When we walk in that victory.
Well, right, and so to Christ belongs the victory, right? I'm looking at my notes here, seeing if there's something else I wanted to hit. But Christ has the victory, right? He's had it since the beginning. He will have it to the end. This is a reference to his eternal victory, right? So we can often, partly because we're dramatic 21st century individuals, think that there was a chance that Jesus was going to lose, right? We see this a lot with how people take the temptation of Christ, right? Well, the devil was tempting Jesus, and there was a chance that Jesus was going to fall into temptation. And that's not true. There was never a chance that Jesus was ever going to fall into temptation. The devil was fighting not only a losing battle, but a predestined to lose battle, an impossible battle. By the way, this is a segue to give you one of my favorite Pieper quotes, which is, some people might say, well, then why would the devil be so foolish to tempt God? And to which Pieper responds, no one said the devil was not a fool, right? So the devil never had a chance. Jesus was never going to lose, right? He's God, after all, right? And so he was never going to lose. So his victory is an eternal victory from the first to the last, just as Jesus is eternal from the first to the last. Christ is also the beginning and the end of salvation, right? Jesus doesn't just give you an infusion of grace and then let you finish the job, right? Jesus doesn't just pick up where you, after having a heart moving towards God, Jesus doesn't just finish off where you left off, filling in the empty gaps. No, Jesus is the beginning of your salvation, and he is the end of your salvation. And just in case you're trying to get a little bit too human on me, he's all the middle parts too, right? He is the entirety of your salvation. The relationship with Christ to his church is an eternal one. The relationship of Christ to you is an eternal one. Christ identifies himself as the living one. There are two references here. One of them is really easy to come across. The other is more Old Testament. The Old Testament one is that Christ is a living God, unlike all the dead idols that were worshipped in the Old Testament. All like the other dead gods, the things that aren't real, right? They're not living gods, they're just stones or whatever it may be. Christ is the living God. He is living and active. He is not like the idols. Additionally, he has risen from the dead. He is living and alive forevermore. And because of the resurrection, calling Christ the living one is a confession of that resurrection. It's a confession of everything that Christ has done in his resurrection. And then finally, that Christ says, I have the keys of death and Hades. Christ is in charge of death and Hades. And I'm not saying hell, and those of you who know why I'm not saying hell know why I'm not saying hell. But Christ has dominion over death and Hades. He has conquered over them, in his life, death, and particularly his death and resurrection, no longer, not that they ever were, but they are not under enemy control. He holds the keys. He is the one in charge, right? If Christ says, you're not going there, you ain't going there, right? If Christ says, I have overcome death and Hades, he has overcome death and Hades. Even though death may come for us, Christ has overcome, right? And, I mean, notice that John is very much acquainted with death coming for the people who are under the care of Christ, right? He starts this section off, I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation. Tribulation has more than one interpretation there, but the primary, the first one, is in this persecution, right? John is being persecuted at the moment, and a number of the brothers have died because of the faith. In all likelihood, there are no other disciples left. John is the last one. Now, Matthew may still be kicking around somewhere. We don't know. But in all likelihood, at this point, all of the other disciples have died. John is the last one. So John knows what it's like for the believers to die. Yet, Christ gives comfort. He is in control of death. He is in control of Hades. So there are things we need, not fear. Questions that will take less than 30 seconds to answer. Or more, and I'll just be late to the late service. All right, well, let us close then with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, thank you all. Tables and chairs do need to get put back up. Next week, this is the last of this class, whatever you want to call it. Next week we'll begin the summer Sunday school, where everyone up to incoming 7th graders will be meeting at the beginning in here with you all. I have taken my incoming confirmands through outgoing seniors, and I will put them through a deep dive into Ephesians. So we're going to have our own grand time, but you guys are going to be doing your own thing.